I'm Margaret Heffernan. I'm a professor of practice here at the University of Bath School of Management. I've led 5 businesses, that's the practice part. And I write books and articles about how business works or how it sometimes doesn't work. One of the biggest challenges that business faces today is so huge that many scarcely see it. This is, of course, the climate crisis. In January, a survey by PwC of some 4,500 CEOs showed that just 22% of leaders have even made a net zero commitment. Of those, without such a target, more than half do not think that their company emits significant greenhouse gases. This strongly suggests that leaders in those companies do not understand carbon impact. 55% of chief executives without a net zero commitment admit they don't even have the capacity to measure their emissions. And only 13% have incentive plans that are linked to decarbonization. All of which leads to a very sad picture showing that climate change is so far having very little impact on business strategy. So there is a long, long way to go. And there isn't much time to effect the radical change, which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we have got to make by 2030. So business leadership has never been so crucial, and sadly, it's never been so invisible. So what can we do, any of us, all of us, to galvanize and accelerate the business response to the single greatest challenge humanity has ever faced? With me here today are 2 inspirational, pragmatic, and active women. Dr. Annie Snelson-Powell is a lecturer here at the University of Bath, whose work focuses on how businesses are responding to the pressure to become more sustainable. And Nadine McCormick from the World Business Council from Sustainable Development. I'm going to be talking to each of them in the first half hour of this session, and the rest of the time is for your questions and comments. So please put them below in the chat, and I will get to as many as I possibly can. But first to you, Nadine, welcome. First of all, can you tell all of us what the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is and what you do there?
Super. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you here today, Margaret. So yes, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, it's WBCSD. It's actually probably the hardest acronym you'll ever have to try to say. It's a coalition of more than 200 international companies where the CEOs come together and the technical leads within the company too, to accelerate the transitions that are needed to get to a net zero, nature positive and a more equitable world. We do that by coming together in work projects, building knowledge, building understanding, breaking down the actions that are needed, and then scaling that through the different networks that our leading companies are members of. At least, that's the theory, and of course the practice we'll get into now today.
Sure. And what is it, do you think, that leads people to join the council?
Well, we were started just over 25 years ago. So the clue is in the name. So as the sustainable development was just emerging as a term, corporate social responsibility was just being born, and companies coming together being curious, like, well, what does this mean? We want to understand this because we think we can see a role for our companies in this space. And I think, well, I haven't been around 25 years ago in this workspace, but I was studying 20 years ago at Bath, and we could see already how the discussions have gone from a very philanthropic, maybe a bit risk focused, to more efficiencies, and now actually more role of business in society. So that would be probably an evolving motivation over the years.
Right. And in terms of companies that are taking sustainability seriously, where does responsibility sit these days? I mean, I know that for a long time, CSR was a slightly marginal activity, and my understanding is, it's become very much more strategic. Where does sustainability typically sit in a company's org chart?
Typical. We can talk about typical in terms of different stages of the journey. So I think a company right at the beginning of their journey, typically it might be, as you say, like this side department, that's the CSR department. They're the ones who are responsible for this. as a company starts evolving more in their journey and, to say, getting more strategic, you start seeing it becoming more cross-cutting, probably still sitting within the sustainability department. And then more leading companies, the governance structures start kicking in place. And so especially those with C-suite, for example, you start seeing the creation of roles of chief sustainability officer with ultimate responsibility. Is our energy efficient light there? Ultimate responsibility at the CEO level. So looking at governance structures is one of the key factors that the new task force on nature-related financial disclosures is looking at, to see where do the decisions lie in a company. And we see going higher up there on the journey.
I know that a lot of the CEOs that I work with and that others work with struggle with where to start, because one of the issues around climate is it's so complex that it touches everything.
Yeah.
And not knowing where to start, of course, becomes the perfect kind of alibi for doing nothing. And I just wondered, to overcome that inertia, can it be more effective to start with those who are responsible for risk management?
That's certainly one of the entry points we've used within World Business Council. So we have one group which is called Redefining Value. And what they found is going through risk is a key way to help companies, again, who don't understand their impacts and dependencies. I have to say my lens is on the nature lens, but you can actually see climate as I would say as a subset over the nature of the climate systems and the nature systems, but helping and understand impacts and dependencies which relate to risks and opportunities is a first entry point. Yes, but raising awareness at that level. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I remember when we talked earlier, you said, it's much more important to start talking about how we do this rather than can we do this. Can you just describe to us a little bit about how do we do this conversation unfold?
Yeah. So how it unfolds is there's many layers and levels. And so again, back to that entry point, somebody first coming into the journey and they're like, wow, I'm sourcing cotton to process to be able to sell onto fashion. Like they're asking me questions about climate and nature to fill in their SBTIs, and SBTNs are coming to science-based targets for climate, science-based target for nature. I don't know what they're on about. Where do I start? And so a starting point would be to see, well, what are your impacts? You can start looking typically in your sector. There's a lot of guidance out there now. So we start talking about tailored guidance. So not just saying, all business, this is how you impact, but actually then breaking it down. So seeing what sector you're in, where you are in that value chain, probably where you're located. If you're, for example, in a water stressed area, that would influence what you need to look at compared to like a water plentiful area. If you're in an area that's important for climate, for nature, etc. But basically there is guidance, but what the difficulty is navigating your way through to find that part that's relevant for you. But I think the starting point is really working out based on your sector, where you're operating, and also maybe that level of maturity as well. You don't want to be further paralyzed by saying, here's how you work out your science-based targets, when you, as you say, you haven't even got the first starting data. So I think the good news is, though, that when companies start asking these questions, they have more useful data than they think they had. Mm-hmm. And even just in terms of quantities or volumes that are purchased and countries that they're coming from, can be put into some modeling tools now to give you a sense of the scale of importance in that particular region and to help you prioritize and not start with the whole company, but actually start with a certain part, a key region, a key value chain, and go from there. So change the system one step at a time.
Right. So one of the things I'm quite interested in is, the more that people study the climate crisis and biodiversity loss, the more they come to see the complexity of the problem. And I often see people saying, this is so interrelated and it's so complex, it's just impossible to know where to start. Yeah. And I often think, well, actually, maybe in that case, it doesn't really matter where you start. It only matters that you do. Would you agree with that?
Yes. So again, we often hear, well, I kind of know for my direct operations, mm-hmm. and often, but actually, as we talked about previously as well, often within a company, what we see is the main impacts are not at those direct sides. So scope 1 might be a term that you've heard mentioned before, but it'd be like scope 2, and not you, Margaret, of course, thinking of the attendees on the call, but thinking of scope 3, especially down supply chains, and then, gosh, even thinking about the consumer side, And so, yeah, so we're hearing recently now is like, well, supply chains, that's impossible. There's no way I can get that information. I used to work on biofuel sustainability before I joined the World Business Council, and working with a nature conservation organization. And if you spoke to the traders in palm and soil 10, 12 years ago, they were the same. No way can you get traceability on those supply chains. And now actually you can. And also, okay, definitely for some high value commodities and high value products, but we're starting to see that trickle down now as well. So there's lessons to be learned, seeing those triggers of a crisis, for example, around biofuels, and how we can learn lessons on that traceability. So while it might feel impossible now, start with one supply chain and get a minimum amount of information you can build from there. So that absolutely is a good message. Just start and learn from that and build and scale.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that often strikes me in these conversations, which, can be a little bit defensive, here are all the perfectly good reasons why I've done nothing, is that quite often the perfect is the enemy of the good, because I can't do, as you say, with supply chains, for example, because I can't get it perfect. Well, then there's no point starting. I always say, well, yes, there is point starting, because it's going to get better as you go along. But also, if you wait till it's perfect, then it's definitely too late. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. And especially when we think about information on nature, it's actually never going to be perfect. We should never, but then, so like if perfect is the enemy of the good, the framing that we've heard more often is good enough. So then what is good enough? And actually, I think there's different interpretations of that, because there's also risks as well. I mean, I think at the end of the day, these are human beings in these jobs who are trying their best, but maybe they put forward some information that's not good enough. And then suddenly they're shut down by media, by civil society organizations. And so there's that fine line between obviously not having perfect, but having enough information. And so that's actually probably a conversation that needs to happen with the key stakeholders then who help, materiality assessments or others. Like, so what information do you need? How much do you need for you to be reassured that we're doing the right thing? And so again, there's probably a gap there, which is leading to some claims around greenwashing, where somebody's coming in perhaps with the best intentions, but because they don't have enough data and enough to assure whether it's financial investors, whether it's the consumers or government, etc., that so how do we, that's a question I think that we haven't been able to resolve yet.
Right. So it strikes me that part of what you're saying is all of this is evolving. It's developing actually quite fast. Sources of information and insight are developing, it seems to me, at a huge speed. But there's still huge amounts of uncertainty and ambiguity. What kind of mindset shift do you think is required really to get people motivated and productive?
Good question. We've been discussing with a group of partners at the moment about how to shift, mindsets. We can think about companies, but companies don't have minds, right? But they have collections of minds. One of the fun ones to dive into, I think, are accountants. So as we get to these more advanced companies, the accountants start getting involved and they're like, right, so now we might need to do a profit and loss account for nature and for climate. So we need data. So when we talk about a mindset shift here, what we're trying to work with accountants to do is be reassured, again, back to that good enough, the perfect doesn't exist. We can still make good, credible decisions and investment decisions and relay that information to external stakeholders. And so actually not searching for the perfect would be one shift in mindset. And I think maybe just a more general mindset shift as well, I kind of alluded to at the beginning, but I think some companies, again, starting this journey are coming in because it's the nice and the right thing to do. It's kind of very philanthropic. It's on the side, but really we need change in business models and how we're running business and the overall purpose, not being shareholder, but stakeholder led. And there's some nice pieces around stakeholder capitalism, etc. And so how do you get that mindset shift to happen? I think what, again, it happens at a collection of individuals getting aha moments. So aha moments previously that I've heard are, an executive stepping off a plane and like choking on fumes of a factory that they're supplying from. They're like, my God, what's going on? Oh, that's our factory. And not standing for it and getting a click moment. So they're kind of the more traditional ones before, people could fly or, for COVID, etc. Now, aha moments are when your kids your family members, your neighbors are out striking on Fridays for the Future, and they come back home and they say, what are you doing in your company and your job, and what are you doing about this? And actually not having a response that makes you feel good in front of your children or thinking your grandkids, etc. And so we're starting to see other shifts in individual mindsets, which are then helping they translate that back into companies and think, well, actually, we need to go beyond just doing the minimum in terms of risk and safeguards and a few efficiencies here, but how do we radically then transform what our business offers and why we're doing it? And again, we're still working that one out.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I remember reading a fantastic paper in Science where which showed that the biggest impact in terms of changing the minds of white conservative American men, the biggest influence was their teenage daughters. And that what was happening is the teenage daughters would be learning about climate and the environment and stuff at home, at school, and they'd come home and around the dinner table, you know, be talking about this. Yeah. And that was the way in which this most recalcitrant group of climate deniers tended to change their minds. So it wasn't facts, it wasn't rallies, it wasn't politics, it was suddenly seeing the future in their kids' eyes.
Yeah. No, amazing. I like that story. It makes me of another piece that I saw through RARE, or an NGO group that do a lot on behavior change too. And they looked at factors for change that sticks in environmental campaigns, so not necessarily in business, but environmental campaigns. And one of the factors they saw was the role of peers. So if a peer comes to you and says, oh, I'm doing this really cool nature-based solutions in our watershed at the moment. Oh, really? What are you doing? And actually, the fact that they're doing it, it's less about, as you say, the facts and the guidance and how you do it, but because that peer was doing it, that actually is the biggest determiner of whether that change will then stick going forward. So there's definitely a role of peers and networks, and yeah, within WBCSD, I can't even say my own acronym. That's what we try to leverage as well, that role of peers to help kind of raise the bar and help everybody go that bit quicker. We talk a lot about like race to zero, etc. But as you mentioned right at the beginning, like we're not going quick enough. And so really using peers and those pacemakers to try to kind of help encourage companies to go along. Now, there's obviously there's different ways of encouraging, but I'm sure we'll come back to that as well in our discussions. Yeah.
I know you believe strongly that anyone, anywhere in the organization can be part of this change. I wonder if you could just explain a little bit about how you see that working.
Yeah, no, there's lots of nice pieces of work we've done in this. One is actually with Forum for the Future recently. It's called a Compass for a Just and Regenerative Transition. But there, what we did was we started breaking down and say, well, what does this change look like? And how does it show up in different roles in the company? And so again, maybe anecdotally back to changes that I've seen in companies, it's not always, especially if there isn't a sustainability department yet or a CSR department yet, it's got to start from somebody somewhere. And so often starts with an individual who had a passion for nature and the environment when they were younger at school, who are authentic in their belief that something needs to change and daring to put their hand up and speak to, not necessarily maybe the CEO, but somebody a level down and say, I think we need to be doing something. Right, well, can you tell me more? And actually identifying other individuals and actually making that case internally to then actually start building up. So I've often worked with lone champions in companies who feel, you know, I feel so alone. And this is very true. It's back to the very human dimension in companies. And so it doesn't have to necessarily come from sustainability, especially when you look at, if you're looking at change then within marketing departments, what can marketing do to market products in a way that's actually educational and not about greenwashing? What about those who are sourcing and procuring and actually thinking, well, how do I make change to happen by where I'm sourcing from and offering longer contracts? I say accountants to say like daring to try to think about how to represent the accounts of a company, both impacts and dependencies on natural capital, for example. So every role in a company can play a part in sustainability as well. And the key thing is actually just daring to try something a bit different. Being these corporate entrepreneurs is a nice word I learned recently. And then actually not being alone in that, because it's really, and change is hard and being, you know, alone, but actually finding then those peers to be able to help kind of go on that journey together. So yeah, no, I think, yeah, change can happen at all parts, and it's about getting it to align.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm writing a case study at the moment about a young, well, relatively young executive within Bayer who felt the company wasn't doing nearly enough about sustainability, and basically went and made an argument that more needed to be done. And they turned around and said, well, congratulations, you've got a new job. And she has just really taken off, feels she has a mandate to change quite a lot. It's given her a lot of visibility, and where she had feared that she would be seen as a troublemaker, in fact, she's been seen as a leader, because she was willing to step up and say, this is what I think we should be doing. And I don't know everything, but I don't see anything, right? So what is it we can be doing? Which I think is just a phenomenally inspiring and practical story.
Oh, absolutely. I have another one for you as well, like a large building materials company that shall remain nameless. They wanted to put in place a CSO, so a Chief Sustainability Officer position. So they were advanced on their journey, but still getting to that next level. And they were wanting to look within, because they wanted somebody who understood their company, and an engineer by background. She's like, well, also triggered by a daughter who was striking for nature, a vegetarian, etc., started being more aware of these issues, starting to feel passionate about it. But I haven't trained in this. I'm an engineer. They're like, we want you, because I guess maybe one of the traits that what sets kind of these effective sustainability champions apart from others is really authentically believing this. So this is not, yes, there's a head issue here. There's knowing the data, knowing the facts, knowing the models, but there's the heart and being convinced too, and being able to convince others. And so, yeah, it doesn't matter if you're not necessarily an expert in these things. I mean, we all did biology at school. We all learned the basics of natural cycles. So actually that's enough to get you going, and actually taking that conviction and motivation that something needs to be done, actually probably the best determiner of actually whether you're going to have success in this role. But it shows that anybody can do it if you believe in it.
Right. Yeah. Nevertheless, this is a pretty daunting task. Where does your own energy and optimism come from?
Oh my goodness, that's a good question. I don't, well, again, I'm one of those people. I was super interested in nature when I was little, and I guess, but I did IML, the Management and Modern Languages program in Bath, but then there was modules on ecological action in management, which actually really spoke to me. So I was like, oh yeah, maybe I don't want to go in financial management. Maybe I wanted to go this other path. I think more recently, I don't call myself an expert. I have one of those apps where I heard a bird call today. I was like, what's that? Well, that's a nut touch. I had no idea, but I think my passion is around connecting with people and individuals. And one of my values is really making a difference. And and I guess I make sure I go out for a walk every day with nature. I have kids as well who are actually, I love when they had a recycling session at their school. My youngest was like, oh yes, I know all about this recycling. And my mum, her job is she saves the world. And I clearly don't. I make a teeny tiny contribution, but that's also quite motivating, knowing that I'm on the right side. So in 20, 30 years time, when we get to 2050 and we've breached the, this 2.5 degrees, that I was on the right side trying anyway to make a difference. But
I absolutely agree. Nadine, thank you. I'm going to turn now to Annie Snelson-Powell, who is an academic here at the university, but comes at this problem from a practitioner's background and teaches about theories of responsibility in business. From your perspective, Annie, what do you think is really getting in the way of acting on climate change?
Well, thanks so much, Margaret, for having me. And Nadine, I'm a bit blown away to hear about the whole range of insights you've covered there. It's extraordinary, and lots of things to resonate with my research. So, Margaret, your question was, and I've lost it already. You gave me a question, I think, and I was introducing myself.
That's quite all right. I was just saying, really, this is such a huge and complex topic. Where do you think really, what do you think is really stopping people from acting on it? I mean, clearly it's the complexity, but do you think there are other barriers in the way in terms of action?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think this is the question, I guess, I'm most interested in. So I think we all already know about this concept of greenwashing, and that's one way I quickly summarize my research area, which is where organizational talk and organizational actions are somehow disconnected. And that might be a lag. So it might be that we announce things before we're ready, or it could be some kind of distraction. It might be because there are no actions there and firms are seeking to make themselves look better. So I think we understand this concept of greenwashing, but in a way there's the scope for it to backfire a bit. And I think in some ways, the notion that firms know about greenwashing, they know that they could experience a judgment of being called a greenwasher, which would be very damaging to them, I think can hold them back. So it's a strange kind of paradox that they want to be doing the right things, they want to be seen to be doing the right things, but actually in the very act of doing the right things, they're taking an awful lot of risk and they become very self-conscious. And Nadine used the word sort of paralyzing. I guess from the complexity perspective, that's true, but it's also true from this notion of kind of strategic appearances can be quite paralyzing. So I think we know that firms feel quite confident about doing the increments that we can see around us, so that there are things that we can do every day to be a bit more sustainable, and that's wonderful. But more or less, that's nowhere near what needs to happen right now. What we're talking about here is huge organizational transformation. For that to happen, organizations need to be doing things really differently, and these are going to be things that, and you've already used the notion of imperfect. These are going to be things that fail. These are going to be things that don't go so well, and they certainly aren't going to happen very quickly. So this idea that firms need to experiment, they need to learn, they need to innovate and change is something that's a transition that I worry is a little bit stalled at the moment. So hearing Nadine talk so passionately, I can see that we do have scope to unblock. But I would agree that that is my observation in what I see around us is that the pressures to be sustainable are super high right now. And that's impacting progress in a strange kind of paradox, really.
Do you think, I mean, one of the things that you made me think of is that, of course, when the pandemic struck, suddenly firms found in themselves a capacity to change and change really quickly, a capacity to experiment with all sorts of stuff, which they could have done 10 years earlier in terms of things like remote working, but under the cosh, they definitely were able to do a lot more radical change a lot faster than they'd probably ever imagined. Has that been good learning? Is that something that companies can build on, do you think? I mean, we speak to that and really using this new talent they've discovered in themselves.
I absolutely think it can be a power for good. I really do. But I think there's two pathways that can emerge. One is where the learning that happened very quickly can be embedded and built upon. And the other is that we use that learning and capability to really reinforce what we were already doing. And so I kind of see that we have this kind of sort of supercharged ability to step forward at this moment out of the pandemic to really leverage the things that these virtual technologies, that boost that we've had through the pandemic and doing things quite differently, what that's given us. I think it's also changed how we see the world. I think we all now are acutely aware of how joined up we are to one another. So I think the salience of the business and society relationship has never been clearer. And that also has had a boost through the pandemic. So I think there is reasons to be optimistic about all that potential that's there, ready to be deployed. But I think without explicitly putting that to this purpose, we could easily see a drift back to the norms that were there from before, that sort of coming back to the old ways of doing things.
So do you think that's more the pull of the status quo, or is any of this about climate denial?
I can't really comment on that, because I think personally, I thought climate denial was kind of gone.
Yeah.
So I would say 10 years ago, when I gave my first sustainability lecture to some executives at Bath, I think I spent the first half of it explaining to them what sustainability was in the first instance, and then persuading them about why it was that firms would care. And I would have some defense to this. So it was a challenging part of the lecture. And recently I gave the same lecture again to the same cohort 10 years on. And I thought, gosh, I don't do that anymore. We just start at the beginning. These managers, they know. And I would say there is never, at least not vocally, a climate denier in the room anymore. And I would have said that possibly was the case before. I'm not saying it's gone away. It's just that I haven't. It's not been on my radar for a long time. I'm sure it can be dangerous.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the data shows that, I don't know, something like nearly 80% of the population thinks, yes, this is real and we have to do something. And so that really is not the issue anymore. The issue is where and how and what, and particularly how fast. Do you think the requirement for transparency is helpful in terms of keeping standards high, or is it actually kind of unwittingly driving this fear of doing anything transparently, lest it be less than perfect?
Yeah, I mean, I think, transparency, the idea here is that sunlight is the best medicine, and we're going to be able to fix things if we're simply honest and open about how we do that. But I think the performance of transparency is the issue here. So I think genuine transparency, and I would say that I would recognize that when I see a firm telling me all the good things they're doing, but also telling me what their challenges are and the mistakes they've made and the pollution they've created, the issues that they've had, at the same time as we talk about the good stuff. So I would say I recognize transparency from firms when I hear both sides of the story. The problem is when you have kind of selective transparency there, is that we're kind of hiding things around it. We're creating the illusion that we're making this progress and we're being honest about what happens, but we're actually talking about activities that are on the periphery, or perhaps activities that really aren't going to change anything. So you may be being transparent about the amount of recycling you do, but actually that's not sufficient given the industry, as Nadine was talking earlier. What is the issue that impacts your firm in your industry is very, very context specific, what sustainability means. And so, we need to know about that. Mm-hmm. We need to know about what the number one challenge is, rather than be told about, the smaller changes that are more obvious and evident. And sometimes transparency gets sort of jumped upon and used to create these illusions that the progress is there when actually it's absent. But as I've said before, this notion that firms are self-conscious, I do think it's something that we have to find a way of kind of getting into, and perhaps it's those leaders in the field that need to be opening up and being honest with us, telling us when they make mistakes, showing us, leading the way in delivering this kind of trying and failing and trying again and getting it right eventually. We need to see those learning processes before firms more generally are going to admit to the real challenges that they face in becoming sustainable in a quick time frame.
Yeah. One of the things I'm very struck by is how many companies and company leaders are fantastically good at coming up with alibis, right? Reasons why they can't, mustn't, aren't allowed to make the changes that of course they would actually personally really like to see. And one kind of strategic manifestation of that is, well, we can't do all these things, but we do offsetting. I wonder if you could just talk to me a little bit about offsetting, good, bad, indifferent. How do you know a good offset from a bad offset? Is the whole idea just a complete waste of time? What do you think?
In a nutshell, I have some big doubts about offsetting, but I think we probably need to do some clearer research in this space, and I think offsets need to be very detailed in the fullness to which you understand what it is that you're offsetting. I think there's been some we all know about the offsetting your flight, this huge kind of carbon costs, which you used to be able to sort of buy away somehow. When you bought your ticket, you pay a small surcharge to offset this. I don't know what was really happening there. More recently, we've had fossil fuel firms sort of claiming that you can buy renewable energy from them. And what you're doing then is implying that the product that you're buying is completely carbon neutral, but you're buying it from a firm that is not carbon neutral. So they're still digging up. So how does the overall balance? Doesn't add up. None of it stacks up. And I'm interested in offsets, and I think they could be really powerful. But I think there's this issue. I think they could be abused. So we need to know a lot more, I think, about how we can use them.
I can see Nadine is dying to jump in here. So Nadine, please do.
Yeah, I think what's maybe we can add to this discussion is like an offset in isolation or by itself is not going to achieve big change. I think as part of a strategic approach, and we use the mitigation hierarchy. So that resonates quite well in business, and the different steps of the mitigation hierarchy, slightly different terms depending what sector you're in or your entry point. But in typically, we're supposed to avoid and minimize first. So you halt the loss, and then we can start reversing and adding back more. And so that avoid and minimize is very important. So what are your strategies for avoiding emissions in the first place? What are your strategies for actually minimizing and the efficiencies part? And where there's a residual piece, then offsets, and offsets done well can actually be great for nature and great for people, as well as great for climate. And there are lots of safeguards out there. And so some of those leading schemes that invest and support offsets, there are standards for that. So what's needed in that accountability space is that the funders of those ask for the standards, the ones who are developing follow the standards, that consumers are checking, are you following the standards? And so there's an accountability loop that comes all around. But I think it's important that this broader context and the strategy and offsets, or that's on the climate side. On the nature side, you might have heard terms around nature-based solutions. They came out quite strongly in the COP26 in Glasgow recently. They're the same, they're talking about protecting, restoring, sustainable management of landscapes for climate outcomes, for water outcomes, for health outcomes, etc. But done poorly are a risk, done well provide a great opportunity. But I might throw another link in the chat box. We did a nice piece of work with We Mean Business and Business for Nature, just actually looking, and we went in for those small stories of case studies on offsets and nature-based solutions. And we realized, hang on a minute, this is a potential risk for greenwashing. Expand to what strategic approaches. So again, it's going from ad hoc to strategic. When it's part of a strategic approach, then it has to be part of the solution, because we don't have time for the rest of the other activities to come. We need all levels of the mitigation hierarchy to be deployed. We can't wait again for the perfect.
Right. We've had a nice, interesting question from Colette Dorwood, who says, isn't the bigger potential catalyst what's happening in the energy market right now as a result of geopolitics? I just wonder, Annie, what do you think? Is this another wake-up call?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I'm really worried. Let's hope so. It could be, but we're also seeing another line of news about opening up oil fields that were closed before. So we've had progress along these two pathways. So yeah, probably too soon to know. But I think, it is that there is some a moment for these shifts that occurs, and these are good times for firms to be making those transitions. And I liked what Nadine was saying about the shift from ad hoc to strategic, that given this shift is a moment to make those kinds of change, given that there's some potential there. I can see that.
Yeah. And there's a question for both of you, really, from Viola. How can we make unwilling companies realize that not doing their part, not participating in climate action, might end up being more expensive for them in the long run than investing in sustainable business solutions today? She said she thinks lots of companies still look at climate action and sustainability as expensive options rather than a necessity. Nadine?
Yeah, I think maybe I'd start by breaking it down again and thinking, when we talk about our company, like what company are we talking about? What sector are they in? Where are they in the value chain? When I think companies who have large impacts, they have a large carbon footprint, are getting it now, because we are starting to get reporting requirements and setting targets. And so that kind of feel for high impact companies is coming in. I think what we're missing here is that, we haven't done enough up to this stage, that we are already witnessing climate change. And we're already seeing changes in war, in droughts, in flooding, and other disasters. And so we also need this resilience lens, and resilience often comes back to linking to nature and its dependencies on nature for those services. And so I think coming into that lens of dependencies, And thinking of exposures to supply chain shocks, for example, are a way of getting the ones that maybe have a smaller carbon footprint, but actually have a big dependency. And therefore, what else do they need to be doing to help try to minimize their future risks? And I think the last point to say is, again, because climate change is real and it's already happening, we're already starting to see case study stories. This may be something that Beth and your students can help with now, but actually pulling together some of those cases where we can see companies who have, because they haven't started taking steps already, and I'm looking back up to Richard Fairchild's questions at the beginning, where they haven't started taking action. They've been hit on a reputation level with consumers, that they're actually starting to be hit with efficiency reasons because of flooding or a drought, for example. And we can start seeing some of those case studies now and sharing them back to that peer role, but like looking at those case studies and sharing them with peers to then start triggering those actions. So there's a start. Yeah.
Annie, how does this speak to the work and teaching that you do around responsibility?
Well, what occurs to me really at this point is that is thinking about how we can get firms to join up, because there are some costs, right? And it is, you know, we also know that there's going to be a payoff if you invest. We just don't know quite how that's going to function completely. And so with those uncertainties, I wonder if we need to join up. We need to be tackling this at an industry level. And so that the solutions become something that firms do together. And so they can all put their hands up together at the same time and say, yeah, I work in this industry. We massively pollute this water supply, or we know that we have this issue to do with child labor. And together, that the industry can invest, and it becomes something that they cooperate on, because it feels too uncertain for any one firm to take that first move. And it's, you know, this notion that we're going to follow our peers is really important. We need to be guided with about how to behave. So I'm not sure what that solution looks like, but a way of letting industries own up to the issues that they uniquely face and share the burden of getting there as quickly as possible together.
Right. I think many of the CEOs I work with will certainly say, well, there's all this cool stuff I'd love to do, but I daren't do it because it's going to, short term, it's going to make my business more expensive than my competitor, and now I'm at a disadvantage. And that is the point at which they have all started saying, I would prefer that this be regulated. Now, it's a kind of amazing moment when a lot of senior, business leaders actually want to be regulated. But do you think that that would have the impact that they're imagining? Either of you?
I think it could. I think we also see these sort of paradoxical effects where sometimes regulation, particularly sort of soft law and certifications and so on, allow firms to kind of get the badge of sustainability and really not change very much. So I think they have to be designed very specifically to resolve the issues in the industry, and not sort of generally there to be, you spend a few $100,000 and you can become part of this club and wear the badge of sustainability. But I think there has got to be something in that space to generate some momentum very soon, because all firms are contributing to this crisis. All firms are, and all firms should therefore pay. And we need to find a way to kind of break the paralysis that we see around us, the deadlock.
Yeah.
Maybe I can come in here.
Nadine, I just wonder how far the businesses involved in your organization, can you ever foresee the day where together they go to governments and say, please regulate this? We will advise you on how to get the regulation right, but we will not have the impact we want to have unless it's a level playing field.
Well, it's funny to say that. So I'm speaking to you from Geneva in Switzerland, where I live. And just this week and last week, we've had government discussions from the United Nations talking about the Paris Agreement equivalent for nature. So the Convention on Biological Diversity. And we had business here. Actually, we had a record number of businesses. We actually had 35 businesses that were represented here in Geneva. And one of the statements read out was to say we wanted to have this higher level of ambition from governments. And in side meetings, we had business saying, with heads of delegations saying, please regulate on nature in this case, because we need that as a policy signal for me to make my case back internally. And again, I'm coming back to Richard Fairchild's question, which I think is a really great question, that these motivations, even leading companies appreciate the value of the regulation to try to raise the bar. And so I'm thinking about especially the laggards that aren't moving in our change adoption curve. The only way to get to those laggards is by regulating. That doesn't mean that we still won't have the leading companies, and you've always got the bar that keeps raising as well, but at least the bar on the bottom in terms of what's minimum requirement is set. And I think that's an important motivator. And I think the other part I would say is the role of finance. And so what we're starting to hear now from our member companies is, well, first of all, again, back to the nature champions who I work with, again, I can imagine the equivalent would be climate champions too, but the nature champions would be like, well, it's funny because we do this great stuff. We have a great strategy, we've got great projects, but the financial investors, they never ask me about that. Recently, in the last 6 to 12 months, there's been a massive shift. And now a lot of financial institutions are starting to ask questions, but they're not the right ones. And so we're working with some groups of financial investor companies, so the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge group, for example, who've come together and they've come up with a guide. So for those analysts in asset managers, basically, to be able to come to the investor relations department in a company, that they ask the right questions, and then the investor relations have access to the right data to be able to ask those questions. And so that regulation part to kind of like have that minimum floor, and then the financial investors, again, as they start realizing the risk and the operational risks that they're exposed to, as well as reputational risks, to get them to ask the right questions. But we still need that bigger change, or that big business model shift. And there, I think we're still playing around with levers for that, because this doesn't come from, as I read somewhere recently, if you have to ask what's the business case, you haven't had that mindset shift individually yet. This is the right thing to do. This is inherently the right thing to do. Let's find a way to do it. You don't necessarily need the business case to be proven to you. You know it's the right thing. You're going to make it happen. So how do we do that? I think that's back down to those individual trigger moments.
Right. There's a really interesting question here from Julia Adamczak, asking about digital and professional services companies, which seems, she says, still to act as if recycling and now home working is the peak of their sustainable efforts. And I think, when I consider the data that I quoted at the beginning of our session about the number of companies that think they have no carbon footprint, I suspect that is significantly services companies and digital companies that think, well, we're just making an app, right? Yeah. Where do both of you think, and I'll come to you, Annie, first, where do you think for those companies that can't really see the carbon impact that they're making, where do they start?
Well, I'd love to hear what Nadine has to say on it, because I think my answers are kind of adrift from the sort of the practical experience she has, because I think these that understanding of what's going on in terms of what you're buying, what you're selling. I think in terms of professional services, these are personnel, they're people, aren't they, that are selling their time. And, I think that's something really interesting to try and assess. And of course, there's the technologies they use, and those have carbon costs too. And we're only just beginning to fully understand the impacts of those. They're very much kind of hidden somewhere in a data center somewhere. But using huge resources, and it's exponentially growing, right? So the amount of the data we're consuming has an energy cost there. So I can absolutely see there's a range of activity that needs to happen in that particular sector. And I'd be really curious to see what Nadine's guidance would be about professional services sector.
Nadine?
Yeah, no, great question. Again, I love and very timely. I think I'm going to split that, because I think digital, I also think like IT type things as well. And then there's professional services, and if you think of the big four and the others as well. But on again, every department having his role. So one of my neighbors, it seems, I hadn't realized this, I just met him recently, set up a green IT type company. And he said, it's really interesting trying to meet companies where they are in the journey. They start asking for, do you have recycled computers and actually recycled servers? But what he's interested in is getting him on that journey and then helping them advance more quickly. And so actually then seeing the role of IT. So we actually talked about data earlier on, and how do you know and how do you measure? The IT department and the digital services that support them are actually key unlockers to get to this transparency that we need in supply chains. And so actually there's a role from thinking of how do we just provide the minimum service, but actually aiming for the bar high and what can we contribute to sustainability. On the professional services side, I think, again, it's back to that, is this seen as a niche product on the side, or is this fully mainstreamed? And what we're starting to see now, was it ERM? Now are offering an MBA in sustainability to all of their employees now. So they're really trying to embed it. I think that's pretty awesome. I think it's ERM. And so it's not just this niche side project, but every project that they do, they should be embedding sustainability principles in that project. Arup is another great example in the UK. So engineering consultancy company in the built environment space, but I think energy as well. And again, their customer comes for, we want you to design a building or a district in a city. And they don't just provide what the customer asks, they take the customer on that learning journey with them so that they can actually integrate nature-based solutions and have solutions that are good for climate, nature, and people. And so it's about their role to actually influence their customers in this case, or others. And so I think these service providers are recognizing that the potential catalytic role that they have to play.
Right. One of the things that puts me in mind of is what Microsoft is doing. And one of the things I find most interesting to read, interesting professionally to read, is Brad Smith's blog about Microsoft. And one of the things that Microsoft is doing, and they've set themselves very ambitious carbon targets and deadlines, is they have a carbon tax for every single thing that anybody in the company buys, whether it's, plane tickets or desks or stationery or servers or whatever. And I think what's so important and intriguing about that is that it means that essentially every single person who spends a dime of Microsoft money is educated as to the carbon impact of that money. So it's creating a mechanism by which, in the way that in most businesses people think about money all the time, that's now coupled with thinking about carbon impact all the time. Does this sound like progress to you guys, Annie?
Yeah, it really does. I mean, the reason that I like this example in particular is because it's pervasive. So if we looked at any one of these little accounting mechanisms for buying a desk or planning some travel, we could pick holes in it. I'm sure we could. It could be better. It may not be properly calculating carbon cost, and we could worry about that. But the fact it's everywhere is the point. So moving from these small pockets of activity to it being something that becomes embedded and normalized, I think this is what we're seeking to do here in all organizations, moving from those kind of ad hoc arrangements to the real strategic stuff, moving from the side department where the ethics or the compliance happens on the side to it's something being integrated. But what's interesting about this example is it's not something that we can just click our fingers and make happen, right? It's not like a top-down kind of thing that you can just say, I'm going to put this in, because we don't quite know what that little accounting tool needs to be in every single one of these situations. It involves that kind of ground up kind of thinking. And it's about that contest between how does a leader make that happen, and how can leaders invest in their people to make these solutions, and then come and support it and eventually join up the dots, and so that we do have these solutions. I don't know how they did this or put it in place, but I think that's what firms need to aim for, is coming to what is a pervasive solution. Yeah. And not imagining that they'll get there straight away. They're going to have to find out how. And yeah, so that's kind of the interesting place that we find ourselves, but it's a really interesting example.
And I think what's quite also intriguing and impressive is they're very upfront at saying the carbon pricing is going to be imperfect, but the way we're going to learn how to do it well is by doing it a lot. Nadine, what are your thoughts on carbon pricing?
We need some signals to be able to help us go in the right direction. I like analogies a lot. So we kind of have this North Star, though apparently that's not very good, Southern Cross or a beacon is kind of more hemisphere neutral. And the beacon, we kind of don't know exactly where it is, but as long as we've got these signals to be able to navigate our way there, then isn't that good enough? And so, yeah, in the spirit of having more information, so our economists on the call as well, or the behavioral economics especially, would be interested in this, because then as consumers, then we can start making more informed decisions. They're not perfectly informed, but they're more informed. And I'm just thinking of the equivalence that we saw, that innovation around the energy efficiency for appliances, for example, right, and how that shifted ratings, and even actually see the bar ratings, because I realize now that like our old fridge that we'd had for years and years and years, well, it used to be a high rating, but actually now that would be the lowest of the low, because you've got even better ones coming through now. And so really raising the bar and helping the consumers make the right decision, because yes, they might be aware of the issues, but then not having some kind of signal to know which ones to choose, then those signals then can be used internally for that company to then start retiring certain products. But again, it's back to that one of those first questions we said at the beginning, like how does that change happen in companies? It doesn't happen like overnight. We need that shift to start happening, and this can help send signals. Consumer demand goes down, it can then be used to send signals back in the company where they invest or disinvest from.
Yeah. But we need also, don't we, to educate investors here, because certainly investors are always the alibi. I'd like to do this, but my investors will kill me. Yeah. How do either of you think we get investors to get their head around the fact that there isn't going to be anything to invest in if we don't invest in addressing the climate crisis? Annie?
I don't have any specific expertise in this, but I think now is the time that we can sell it. I think there's been this huge shift recently to ESG from an investment perspective. So this is kind of environment, societal and governance aspects when it comes to choosing investments. And there seems to be this huge appetite where this is becoming very mainstream. So I'm starting to ask similar questions. I also work in the area of human rights, which is kind of associated with this. These impacts overlap. And we're starting to ask these questions about how are investors thinking about these rights in respect of ESG, and we're kind of, our hypotheses is that this is going to be something that will now feature in those decisions. So while I don't have any specific insights, I do feel quite optimistic that there is an audience there. But I like what you said about this, the way to educate the investors. How do they know what to ask for? We need to tell them somehow. And I don't know what that channel of communication is, but these messages need to be clear. But there's a lot to build on, particularly with this momentum in the ESG space right now.
Exactly. Nadine?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of uptake in investors now, and investors coming in going, yes, we're aware of this. Now we need to understand more about it. And so investors are coming together. Again, I know the nature space better than the climate space, but I say groups of investors. I think more than 90 financial institutions have come together around this Finance for Biodiversity pledge, for example. And so, and part of it is back to that education. So they understand from their portfolio, where are their impacts and dependencies, risks and opportunities, so they can ask the right questions then of who they're investing in. And I think, Annie, is something you said earlier, but it's getting those peers together and actually having those associations so that it is happening. And it's just, helping them, to have courage as well in their understanding is enough right now, and just to go for it. But I liked Richard's comment here as well. It was just like, can we actually how do we bring those investors then with the companies that are offering good, and to get that good impact together going forwards? And so actually we've been talking about this as well, just internally as well, like how do you match them together? That's clearly beyond the scope of our work, but if that doesn't exist, I think it's a great idea, and Richard, you should run with it. Don't know what your job is these days, but it's about like getting those because what we hear is business don't want to take the risk all on their own, especially in these early days. We don't know exactly, there is a big risk of failure. And actually I can introduce my favorite acronym, FAIL, first attempt in learning, fail. And actually, because they can't take that risk all on their own, you actually need this blended finance, so a bit of government financing, a bit of corporate financing, a bit with the private investors and others coming together to share that risk. And again, using the right safeguards to then have maximum impact as well. But actually, how do they find each other? That's a good question. I don't know.
We are swiftly running out of time.
Unbelievable. It's gone so fast.
I know, I'm thinking, I had a conversation with the CEO the other day who said for the first time in his life, he felt afraid. And I would like to say that for not the first time in my life, but the most recent time today, talking to the two of you, it makes me feel hopeful. So thank you very, very, very much, both of you, for generous sharing of information, of advice, of sources of information. And I think, you know, if we follow your example and we get started, almost anything is possible. For everybody who joined today, and especially those who posted questions, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for the questions. We'll be here again next month. In the meantime, be safe, be careful, be green. Thank you.